Okay, good evening all. Thank you for attending tonight's meeting. I'm Murdo Mackay, Development Manager at the Corlett, and I'm chairing tonight's session. The purpose of this evening's meeting is to give you some feedback on the 2019 planning application and 7 community meetings promoted the Spaceport Consortium to undertake an environmental impact assessment on the proposed development. So we have Laura Karsh from Western Isles Marine and Environment and Sarah Murray from Aquaterra here with us this evening, and they will present an overview of the work that has been done to inform the EIA ahead of submission to the Planning Authority. Please use the chat function to ask any questions as we go along. We will have time towards the end of the session to answer as many questions as we can within the time frame. Mark Roberts, Spaceport 1 Programme Director, and Alison McCorkadale, Spaceport 1 Development Officer, are also in attendance. The key purpose of the meeting is to provide you with an overview of the EIA, so I encourage you to focus your questions accordingly. The team will also produce a summary of all the questions and answers, and this will be emailed to all attendees, as well as being put online as soon as possible after the event. The session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Corner's website in due course. Questions can be added into the chat section and priority will be given to EIA related questions. So I'm now going to hand over to Laura and Sarah, who will give a presentation with slides.
Okay, Sarah, can you see that?
That's grand, thanks. If you could just go to the next slide, thanks. And the next one, I think we've covered this. Thank you. Okay, so an environmental impact assessment has been undertaken to support a planning application for the Spaceport under the Town and Country Planning Act and related EIA regulations. The proposed development doesn't fall under either Schedule 1 for mandatory EIA or Schedule 2 of the EIA regulations, which has thresholds and criteria related to the type and scale of a development. However, the proposals have undergone the process of EIA due to the relatively novel nature of the project, the proximity to sensitive areas and species, and to address issues that have been raised by statutory and local stakeholders in the previous application. The main purpose of this session is to present the project and provide an update on the progress since the EIA was commissioned last year. We'll set out some of the key changes that have been made to the project and the process of EIA and the receptor topics covered in the assessments. We'll also provide an opportunity for the public to ask questions and provide feedback as the EIA progresses.
So good evening, everybody. So one of the first things we look at in EIA is there a need for the project and is this the most appropriate location? And it's been clear through some of the work that we've done already that there's a clear policy and economic rationale for a spaceport facility in Scotland. There's a rapidly expanding demand for access to space and a growing national capability in very much focused on the small microlift launch sector. And both the UK and the Scottish Government have published in the last couple of months ambitious strategies to grow the space sector with associated significant employment opportunities. This particular project has evolved to focus exclusively on suborbital launches, which reflect a much smaller class of launch vehicle and play a really important role in the wider space supply chain. Not only in helping to develop the wider orbital launch systems, but also very much in their own right as scientific sounding rockets for things like weather observations, research into the study of the upper atmosphere, astronomy and remote sensing. So given that there's a fairly strong political rationale and an economic rationale for a project of this nature, the next question that we looked at was, why should it be built at Skolpig? And we looked at 2 of the key independent analyses which underpinned the decision to site at Skolpig. And those were done at a UK national level. These analyses looked at potential locations for launch infrastructure and this decision-making process to site in this location. And there really is quite extraordinary technical constraints associated with launch facilities, and there's only really a few locations in the UK that could support a development of this nature, and the figure there shows just a few of the locations there, very much focused in the north of Scotland and the islands there. Now, across those independent analysis, Scopig scored within the top 3 or as the best location against those technical and locational constraints. And taking into account the existing range infrastructure associated with kinetic and the skills that were already here, there's also quite a compelling business case associated with siting at this location. The site also meets a number of criteria in terms of distance from residential receptors, and it also has relatively few environmental constraints. So you may be familiar with the 2018 development layout that was scoped as an orbital development. Scoping is one of the earlier phases of the EIA process, and this development comprised of a much larger development than what you saw in 2019 and what will be submitted as part of the planning application in due course. You can see there's multiple buildings originally, 2 launch pads and access tracks to the north of the site, as you can see in the map to the left. Now, since scoping, that project has been substantially reduced and is now focused on providing a permanent, not temporary, as suggested in the 2019 planning application. So a permanent venue for launching the smaller suborbital launch vehicles only. The project will really be the only location of its type in the UK serving this niche suborbital market, whilst 2 other Scottish sites that you may be familiar with in Shetland and Sutherland will really focus on the orbital market. So to reiterate, the layout that you see here on the left represents a standalone permanent project and is not part of a phased development. So in terms of the detailed project layout, the infrastructure is very much based as much as possible on using or upgrading the original infrastructure that's already in place at the site. So around 700 metres of track will be upgraded. The undersized culvert over the Scolpig Loch Causeway will also be upgraded. The current culvert is undersized and contributes to localised flooding. One of the farm buildings will also be upgraded for a storage workshop and communications centre. And that's the farm building there, and that's the existing access track just going down to the south there. New infrastructure comprises additional access tracks, so the 120 metres of access track here, a hard standing area within the farmstead complex, launch pad hard standing area, and a concreted launch pad itself with an integrated pollution control and containment system, part of which you can see in this diagram here, which has been a significant new design change which has been designed in the last few months or so. There's also additional parking proposed just at the mouth of the site for recreational access and the public. So the Spaceport will essentially function as a licensed venue for individual launch operators to marshal their own operations. So each launch operator will have their own bespoke infrastructure and equipment to support their own launch event. So shown here are some representative examples of the type of temporary infrastructure that we might expect to see on site. Now, this infrastructure that you see here is directly associated with the largest class of launch vehicle. So it really does represent a worst case scenario. So there'll be some variability around the temporary infrastructure, but this is really to provide a sense of the appearance and the scale at that opposite end of the spectrum. And Sarah will talk a little bit about how this looks in the visualisations coming up. So in general, you'll expect to see support vehicles. There'll be some, they may or may not be welfare units to support staff. There will probably be containerised fueling systems. There may or may not be command or control systems. You can see here the kind of integrated launch tower and transport system. That's one potential solution for delivering the launch vehicle itself and the rail to the site. And there may be a compressed gas supply. But the key message here is that each launch event will really be quite self-contained and really based on portable units.
Okay, so a number of visualisations of the project have been prepared, covering a range of representative viewpoints. The infrastructure that's most likely to be visible in the landscape is the temporary launch infrastructure, including the launch vehicle, launch tower, and the type of container units that have previously been shown. The first visualisation we have here is from the north of the site and shows the largest launch vehicle that may be launched from the launch pad. So this particular rocket's up to about 10.8 metres in length. And this is likely to be in position for the day of the launch. And then the second visual we have is from the A865 south of Skolpig Farm. And you can just see mainly really the launch tower in the distance and the temporary units to the right there, to the right of Dunskolpig. And then the next visualisation we have here demonstrates the largest launch tower that could be on site for a launch, and it's likely to be erected for around 2 to 4 days at most. The example we have here is a 20-metre launch tower, although most towers are likely to be under 12 metres for the majority of LV specifications we would expect to see on site. And so this one's from the north, and then the second visualisation is from an approximate location of the proposed St Kilda viewing platform that I understand is in planning at the moment. And that just gives you a visual representation of what the tower might look like. And as I say, this is only going to be erected. It could be for as little as 1 day on the day of the launch or a couple of days in site preparation, and then when the site's demobilised. So in terms of launch vehicles, up to 10 launches a year will be undertaken at the spaceport by a range of launch operators with launch vehicles of varying specifications. And as Laura previously described, the LVs may be used for a range of reasons. So it could be static testing of rocket systems at the site, or alternatively, they'll be launched on a pre-designated trajectory limited to orientations to the west or northwest of Skolpig. Separate stages of the LV will fall into the sea at pre-designated splashdown zones, ranging up to approximately 200 to 250 or so kilometres from the site. An LV typically comprises of a series of stages in the payload. So the first or booster stage is ignited at launch and burns through power descent until its propellants are exhausted. The jettison stages of the LV generally include engines, fuel tanks, batteries and electrical components. At the point of jettison, each stage is designed to consume all of the fuel located within the tanks. The nature and composition of the payload can be variable and is based on the client requirements of the launch operator. For suborbital launches at the site, they're expected to comprise of atmospheric monitoring instrumentation, imaging systems, security equipment, or communication technology. Most stages will be designed for retrieval as they'll contain important equipment and data that the launch operator will want to recover. Otherwise, stages will be designed to sink to the seabed. So in terms of the offshore area, a space launch hazard area will be established, and this is to make mariners aware of potential launch activities within the sea area, and it will be included in Admiralty charts. This is the area within which a launch vehicle trajectory may be orientated. The space launch hazard area extends out to 250 kilometres for the longest possible LV flight trajectory. There's significant overlap there, as you can see, with the existing MOD range, which is managed by Kinetic. Trajectories will not cross any landmass, such as St Kilda. Now, marine management procedures will be established in consultation with MCA and UKHO and a range of marine stakeholders, and this will cover aspects like marine safety, stakeholder notifications, launch monitoring and stage recovery of the launch vehicles. The marine management procedures will ensure safe launch of the launch vehicles from the spaceport and include prior notification procedures and operational procedures through a launch campaign. And key measures are there to eliminate risk and minimise disruption to maritime users. So that will include stakeholder updates through local media, advance alert service, notice to mariners and navigation warnings. There'll also be demarcation of safety and notification areas, so exclusion areas where an LV stage splashdown is planned to be, and that an additional buffer area as a safety for mariners, and warning zones to highlight to mariners when they're approaching exclusion zones. There'll also be surveillance and area clearance through range control systems, including VHF, marine band radio, terrestrial radar, and, if required, airborne radar. There'll also be safety patrol vessels and maritime patrol aircraft where needed. And there will also be a range of procedures for launch vehicle recovery. Now, each launch activity will be separately regulated and licensed by the Civil Aviation Authority under the Spaceport regulations, and also with Marine Scotland under the Marine Scotland Act. My colleague Laura will tell you more about the wider regulatory process in a moment. So in terms of the EIA process, if you're not familiar, the EIA report presents the results from the EIA of the project, which is a process that draws together in a systematic way an assessment of the project's likely significant environmental effects. This helps to ensure that the importance of the predicted effects and the scope of reducing any adverse effects are fully understood by the public and the competent authority before it makes its decision. The information and conclusions on likely significant effects presented in the EIA report will be taken into consideration by the planning authority and their advisors as part of the determination of the planning application. The assessments undertaken are based on the worst case scenario to ensure that a precautionary approach is taken. So, for example, the assessments consider the largest possible launch vehicle that may be launched at the site, the noisiest, the range of fuel types that might be used, and ensures that any project design and mitigation measures are implemented to take account of these and minimise any detrimental effects. So the competent authority, i.e. the Council's Planning Department, determines whether the mitigated project complies with legal requirements, such as those for protected species, environmental thresholds, pollution control, that it meets national and local policy objectives, and may require conditions and legal obligations to be attached to the consent. So through detailed design, implementation of the project, so in the construction phase, as well as through site operations of the spaceport, and also monitoring of the project. And these commitments are enshrined in legal process that the developer must deliver.
Okay, so as Sarah mentioned, the EIA report forms part of the planning consent, but for a development of this nature, the process really doesn't stop at the planning consent. Some of you may be familiar with the aquaculture sector. It's a little bit like the aquaculture sector, where once planning consent is issued, a separate regulator will monitor and enforce the operational aspects under a completely different legal system. So should the spaceport be consented, operators of the range and the spaceport will be required to secure a licence from the new regulator of the sector, called the UK Civil Aviation Authority. And that licence has a number of prescribed legal criteria that it must that the spaceport and the range operator must meet to secure that. And the CAA will have an ongoing role in the monitoring, regulation and review of that licence. Also importantly, each launch itself, so every individual launch, will also require a licence from the CAA. And if any of the stages of the launch, as Sarah described earlier in one of her slides showing the different stages, there is a further layer of regulation and control via a marine licence from Marine Scotland Act. So I guess the purpose of this slide is to show that there's a very rigorous regulatory framework that the spaceport, the range and each launch will operate in, and that extends to the marine environment as well.
Okay, so the consortium's consulted a broad range of stakeholders throughout project development, including statutory and non-statutory organisations and the local community at various town hall meetings. Statutory and non-statutory bodies have advised on the approach to the impact assessment for particular EIA topics, so covering issues including species protection, habitat management, pollution control, and also fisheries and navigational safety in the marine environment. They've also been consulted to agree suitable mitigation and management measures to reduce or eliminate potential negative effects of the project. So in some cases influencing project design, and in others requiring commitments from the consortium through the construction phase and in operation of the spaceport, which will likely result in conditions being attached to any planning consent. The questions and issues raised in public feedback have all been analysed and addressed in the EIA, and these can be viewed with the accompanying planning application when this is submitted. So that includes the comments and concerns that were raised in the planning application for 2019, and also comments and questions that were raised during the various town hall meetings that were undertaken throughout the last year or two.
Okay, so the next few slides show some of the work that was undertaken to support the EIA, and as Sarah indicated earlier, it really is a systematic process. And the next few slides we'll run through will show some of that baseline work that has been undertaken for the various topics. Now, unfortunately, we don't really have the time to present all of the findings and all of the subsequent mitigations that were developed, but we can answer questions on those at the end of the presentation and provide guidance on where to get further information. So in terms of the ornithological assessments, we gathered 2 years of continuous bird survey data from April 2019 to March 2021. This included moorland birds, breeding birds, corncrake surveys, guillemot surveys and habitat assessments to assess the behaviours and territories importance of the habitat. In addition to this, we undertook desk-based assessment and consultation with stakeholders including Nature Scotland and the RSPB. For terrestrial ecology, we've undertaken 2 otter surveys and undertaken a full vegetation survey across the entire Scolpig farm site. And the marine ecology assessment was really a desk-based assessment looking at benthic habitats, marine mammals and fish.
Okay, and human receptor topics that were covered in the assessment include a socioeconomic tourism and recreation assessment. A net benefit economic impact assessment is in progress to establish capital expenditure, operational expenditure, potential supply chain benefits and key roles in employment for the spaceport. So the consortium are currently working on finalising the project costs, but specific roles for the spaceport will include a number of management and supporting roles around management of the spaceport and compliance for the licence requirements, safety, security, training and environmental as well. So there'll be a dedicated manager for managing the site for grazing, habitat enhancement, pollution prevention and access management. There are also anticipated to be a number of wider social benefits proposed, such as the crofting tenancy on site and commitment to educational outreach through STEM, and also improved community access with parking at the site entrance and a habitat and amenity plan, which will be detailed shortly. Potential beneficial and adverse effects on tourism recreation, specifically access restriction and improvements, are also covered. A full archaeological and cultural heritage assessment has also been undertaken. This includes a desk-based assessment and site walkover, and direct and indirect impacts such as setting impacts have been covered. Consultation with Historic Environment Scotland and the county archaeologist has also been undertaken.
In terms of the hydrological impacts, there was a topographic survey undertaken for design purposes, which also ensured that infrastructure was sited to avoid any flood risk. Trial pit excavations were carried out to determine the nature of any of the soils and the presence and depth of any peat deposits. There is no peat under the proposed infrastructure. And a flood risk assessment not only informed the placement of the infrastructure, but also the sizing of the replacement culvert over Scolpig Loch. There are a couple of other analyses undertaken looking at groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems and water quality, but probably one of the most important pieces of work that was undertaken was a review of how materials on the site would be stored and managed, and how accidents and unplanned events would be dealt with. and this was undertaken by an industrial process engineer and resulted in quite a few recent design changes.
Okay, so potential impacts on landscape and visual amenity have been scoped out of the EIA in consultation with NatureScot and the Planning Authority. However, visualisations have been provided for information to support the application. A zone of theoretical visibility analysis was undertaken to identify where there's potential visibility of the project in the surrounding landscape, and this was done for the largest launch tower that could be on site, and viewpoints were agreed with the council. It should be noted that this represents the worst case, and a tower is likely to be installed on site for around 2 to 3 days only for a launch. A high-level assessment for marine users and marine assets has also been undertaken, and information from key stakeholders gathered to identify fishing grounds, key shipping routes, recreational use, and identify other key marine users. Consultations are ongoing with key sectors, and this is to ensure that the proposed marine management measures during a launch are appropriate, ensuring safe transit for marine users and that disruption is minimised during a launch. As part of a safety case for each proposed launch, navigational impacts will be assessed for specific launches and measures taken to ensure that all risks are reduced to as low as reasonably practical.
So specialist noise monitoring was done for 2 scenarios. The first scenario was a worst case scenario for launch noise generation, and the second was a worst case scenario for potential sonic boom. For sonic boom, we've modelled this across 3 different trajectory scenarios, and sonic boom really relates to some of the launch vehicle specifications that we looked at, where sonic boom is generated during the descent of those launch vehicles. In terms of air quality, we reviewed numerous propellant mixes representative of actual launch vehicles expected at the site, and we contracted air quality specialists to undertake a screening analysis of those propellants to characterise firstly the emissions and any residues associated with them, and they have just completed a screening dispersion modelling of those fuel mixes. Now that's been taken forward currently to detailed dispersion modelling, which we're hoping to get the results of this week. It's worth mentioning that the outcomes of these assessments is being integrated into the other assessments. So the noise modelling features in the ornithological assessments. Air quality will also feature, integrate into the ecological assessments, impacts and habitat. So all of these assessments are very much integrated in terms of the findings. And finally, there were a number of other topics which were assessed, including aviation, defence, MOD, telecoms, traffic and transport, climate change, accidents and unplanned events. So very briefly, and coming out of all this baseline work and the subsequent impact assessment that was undertaken based on the actual operational aspects of the development and the construction elements of development, we've essentially developed some design modifications and operational mitigations. Firstly, the reduction of the infrastructure from that initial 2018 scoping infrastructure removes a number of impacts and reduces a number of other impacts. So there's no impacts on peat, there's no infrastructure located within the National Scenic Area, and the reduction of the development footprint substantially reduces the impact on the terrestrial habitat. In terms of the operational mitigation, we've listed here a number of these to provide a sense of the kind of commitments proposed. So operational mitigations will cover things like species-specific measures for corn creek and otter. They include mitigations for archaeology, including historic building surveys, monitoring and an archaeological watching brief, where there's various agreements in place with the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency and the MOD to ensure there's clarity in the terms of working the spaceport and the safety arrangements around those. There's access and traffic management procedures that have been developed, And as Sarah mentioned earlier, there's a proposal for an outline habitat and an amenity management plan. And it's worth highlighting that at this stage, and with these mitigations in place, that we don't actually foresee any significant effects associated with the development. But I would reiterate that that is with the mitigations in place. So the habitat and amenity plan, which both Sarah and I have mentioned in the last few minutes, it's one of the mitigations that we felt would be of most interest to yourselves as the community, and this will be an outline form of this plan will be submitted as part of the planning application. So this plan is essentially a commitment to draw together the various interests associated with the site with some form of integrated management. So today you will probably have seen that public access has already been facilitated by new parking and gated access, which will be expanded as part of the consented development if it's consented. And a crofting tenancy is being progressed, which has been offered in conjunction with interim habitat measures developed in conjunction with the RSPB. There's a small extract of the habitat enhancement plan there to your left. So really the purpose of this plan will acknowledge the existing uses of the site and look at opportunities to develop these, along with other interests such as the fishing rights associated with Loch Skolpig and some of the archaeological heritage associated with the site. And as part of this, there is an aspiration from the council to have a consultative element in the development of this plan, and there is a commitment to have an advisory group really steering, informing the direction of this plan, which will comprise of a number of stakeholder or community representatives.
Okay, so in terms of next steps, the EIA team is working to finalise the EIA over the coming weeks, and a planning application with the EIA report and accompanying technical information will be submitted to the Planning Authority for consideration, and that will include site plans, survey reports and technical assessments that we've just briefly mentioned. The application will also be accompanied by a non-technical summary and information to inform a habitats regulations appraisal. And the documents will be available to view on the Council Planning Portal. Unfortunately, at present, due to COVID regulations, paper copies cannot be made available. However, we'll continue to review that situation and see if we can make the documents available, or at very least the non-technical summary, when the consultation period starts. Okay. So I would just say thanks all for your time this evening, and we'll hopefully now move on to any questions that you might have relating to the EIA process, and we'll endeavour to answer as many questions as we can within the time that we have. But what I will say is we'll follow up with a summary of every question that's been asked and responses on the council website if we don't manage to cover everything this evening.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Can I just remind folk you can enter the questions at any time on the chat, and we will start allocating the questions to the best person who can answer them shortly.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Murdo. We've got a question here, I think, Sarah, it's one for you. Has this development had permission? If not, why do you speak about we will instead of we would?
Okay, thank you. Well, in EIA, the language is quite important, and when we're reporting an EIA, we have to present in present tense, but also with the commitments that we're talking about, we have to say that they will be committed to, not that we may or we will, we may or we would do. So we will is quite important language in that context, because as I've described previously, the project will require conditions and legal obligations. So these commitments are enshrined in the legal process that the developer must deliver. So we have to be quite clear about what the commitments will be. And it's really just about the language that is used, as I say, in the EIA report and talking about present tense.
Thanks, Sarah. And a question best answered by Mark. So it's an observation. 6.1% of small satellite launches failed due to a failure in the launch vehicle, sourced NASA. That's more than 1 in 20. You're planning 20 launches per year, so you must expect at least one accident every year.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yeah, I'm familiar with that report, which I think came out in 2019. Looking back, just to correct it, we are planning 10 launches from the site a year, not 20. It would not be credible for us not to be considering the possibility of launch failure, and I have to say that that is what drives a lot of the, in essence, it drives all of the site design, also the management of the airspace, also management of the sea space. So the fundamental principle is that if we have a launch failure, that there is no harm to people. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but there you go.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Another question for Sarah or Laura. Did you do any surveys for important species that are not statutory requirements?
Yeah, I can take that one. So some of the surveys that we have done cover Scottish biodiversity list species that you've alluded to, the questioners alluded to there, and they're captured within that. But we haven't done surveys, for example, for great yellow bumblebee, which is an SBL species. But what we have assessed great yellow bumblebee, for example, through using habitat as a proxy for impacts on that species. So we've looked at the development footprint in terms of a particular Macher environment and made an assessment on that basis.
Thanks, Laura. And probably one for yourself again. How can I obtain detailed information on the terrestrial habitat and biodiversity surveys?
Okay, yeah, well, the surveys, all of the information in the EIA will be made available in the public domain. And if there's particular information you want, we'll be happy to provide that. Everything will be available as part of the planning submission, so it will be accessible through the normal council website. But if it's Christine from Curragh, we'd be happy, of course, to forward that on. As I said, it will be made available in the public domain in any case.
Thanks. And again, for Laura or Sarah, what are the plans for upgrading the roads?
So, sorry.
Laura, do you want to take that, or Sarah, you might not have the specific information in front of you. We can provide it later, but.
No, it's fine, just we're not sure who's taking it, but basically the roads will be, so the upgrades for the roads incorporate a number of elements. First, I think the most important thing is it'll be extended, I think 3 metres, if I can remember from the top of my head, and there'll be additional drainage alongside the side of the road. So mentioned in the presentation, the road upgrade will include a replacement of the culvert at Skolpeg, which will be sized appropriately. The lochs at Skolpeg are currently functioning as 2 separate hydrological units because the current culvert acts as a kind of blockage between those 2 lochs. And as part of the planning submission, we'll be providing those detailed plans on the road upgrades and where the different and excavation profiles for the roads and where particular works will be focused.
Okay, thanks, Laura. A general question, when will the EIA be available to view?
We hope to have the EIA submitted possibly within the next 2 to 3 weeks, and then there's a period for that to go through the various checks, etc. And then that will be made available, but there'll be a notice going out to let folk know when that's uploaded.
Thank you. And there was a question about will the slides and recording be made available to the public? Yes, is the answer to that. You perhaps missed that at the start, but we are going to email out to everybody that's registered for the session, and the question and answer paper, as well as the slides and the recording of the presentation, will be made available on the council website. Got a question which I'll take. It's about the considerable interest from the community to restore vehicular access to the area around the farmhouse for recreation. And we've made reference to parking on the road and the kissing gate, which could be seen as quite discriminatory against disabled members of the community. We've had to think quite hard about this and consult Nature Scot, as they're now called, and RSPB. We are very conscious that under the legislation, we are not required to permit unfettered vehicular access to the site, but appreciate that there is, a strong desire amongst the community to be able to go down to the site with their cars. What we have to be careful of is balancing the desire of the community with the potential for environmental damage. So what we have committed to do is to develop a visitor management plan as part of our more broad plans for the site, but that will have to be done in consultation with the statutory consultees to make sure that we are taking an environmentally sensitive approach. But a question about the Croft tenancy. The Croft tenancy has actually been allocated subject to agreement on the terms of the lease. I'm delighted to report that the successful Crofter is under 40, is committed to living here permanently, and doesn't have access to land already in their own right. So if you bear with me, I've been talking and not monitoring the questions. Okay, so possibly one for a combination of Sarah, Laura and Mark. How will pollution control measures work, and will overpressures experienced at nearby houses be dangerous in the event of explosion? Perhaps Mark, you want to come in first?
Yeah. So I'll let the ladies talk about the pollution control, because there's a lot of effort has gone into that. But if I just address the overpressure issue. So for each launch, we do some, in fact, we and the launch provider does a high degree of analysis. And one of the bits of analysis is to take account of an explosion at launch. The answer to the question is that the vehicles that we are looking at will not have an overpressure of sufficient size for local buildings. In fact, they wouldn't harm the farmhouse. So overpressure should not be an issue for you.
Thanks. Sarah, Laura, anything you want to add?
Well, in terms of pollution control, yeah, as Mark said, there's been a huge amount of effort put into, first of all, understanding what the pollution risks are at the site, and secondly, developing a system that deals not only with those pollution risks, but also potentially unplanned and accidental events, including fire and catastrophic events. So there's no short answer to this. That it's quite a complicated system, but basically there's provision in place for worst case scenarios, launch vehicles, worst case fuel mixes. We have a containment tank, which is 63,500 litres to contain fire water and provide dilution requirements for potential fuel spillages. There is a channel soak away and deluge system integrated into the launch pad, so to ensure that should there be any spillages, there can be remote operation of a dilution system, and that would be there's a mechanism for that to be conveyed to the containment tank, and there's also a sump system integrated into the launch pad for smaller or minor spills to ensure that these are contained in a completely sealed unit within the launch pad. So there are a number of pollution control measures based around a range of different scenarios. And if there's an appetite for it, we can provide much more information on it. But it really has been quite a bit of work to look at all these different scenarios and come up with a strategy for them all.
That's great. So a question for Mark, how many well-paid jobs will be created?
The simple answer to that is 25 direct jobs, rising from a number that's a little bit lower than that, around 20 to 25 as the number of activities increase towards 10. Those are direct jobs, so there will be indirect employment as well associated with the site, but I'm guessing that that's probably the answer.
And whilst you're talking, Mark, can the public still access the beach?
Yes. So the philosophy around the launch activity is that we allow access up to really the last moment before we have to deny access to areas for purposes of safety. And similarly, once an event is done, and what I mean by that, once the launch is done, and there is therefore no more potential risk to the public, then we will open the site up again. There is there's an intent. The same applies to the sea space. The same applies to the airspace. The intent is to provide absolute minimal disruption.
Thank you. And one for Laura and Sarah in terms of submission of the EIA. Is that the start of the 12-week pre-application period?
It's once the application's been verified by the planning authority and then it goes on to the system, then that period starts. But I understand with the way things are going at the moment, we're obviously getting close to the Christmas period, so we fully expect that consultation period to be extended slightly to give folk more time to come back with any comments.
Okay, sorry, another one for Sarah or Laura. So your presentation mentioned sound disturbance, but no details as to the level of sound for each launch has been provided. What is the actual noise disturbance, worst case, of each launch, and how will this noise dissipate? And that's in relation to distances from the site and weather conditions.
Okay, so that's not a particularly easy question to answer, but we have done noise modelling, and I don't know if I can quickly share the slide. Let's see if I can share this with you. I don't know if you can see that.
That's it coming. Yep.
Okay. So this is a extract of the launch noise modelling for the worst case scenario launch vehicle. So this is for the largest launch vehicle, and there will be sound profiles that differ from this. So the little black dots here represent various residential receptors. So this is really a diagram of how that noise dissipates with distance. And again, it's based on worst case atmospheric conditions, and as I said, the worst case launch vehicle specification as well. So the question of what is the actual noise really depends where you are. And of course, this little area just around the launch pad shows quite high levels of noise, which would actually be damaging to human hearing. But with distance, that noise dissipates very rapidly. So to really answer the question, I really need to understand where exactly the receptor was to give you an actual definitive answer, and even that answer would only be partially representative, as this represents the worst case scenario.
Thanks. In terms of historic environment, are there any plans to restore the farmhouse and other buildings not being used in the development? Laura or Sarah, do you want to take that one? At the moment, there are no plans to restore the farmhouse, but what we have pulled out from the EIA process is the importance of the farmhouse and the heritage associated with that. So we did mention in the presentation that we would be developing a habitat and amenity management plan, and that would be subject to a consultative element through an advisory group. So if there was an appetite to do something with the farmhouse, then the advisory group might be a mechanism to take that forward with the council, or as the development progresses over time. But there is a recognition that there is an archaeological heritage associated with the site, and depending on the appetite, how the advisory group and the council want to take forward the site, that could be something that could be looked at in the future. Thanks, Laura. So back to Mark. The number of launches per year seem to vary widely since the first application, and recently in press and PR, and now in this presentation. When will the consortium commit fully to an absolute number of limited launches? Or do the consortium intend to say 10 launches now and then grow this number over time once the project permissions have been granted, should they be granted?
Yeah, the answer is yeah, we are committing to 10, and no, we are not planning on increasing the number of launches over time. So 10 launches from the site is the position we are in, and we will retain.
Okay, and
perhaps, sorry, just to add on that, and the EIA assesses the worst case, which is up to 10 launches. So everything that's covered in the planning application will be linked to that maximum number of launches at the site for this application. And as Laura's also kind of described in the wider regulatory process, there are a lot of stages to go through for each launch, for the launch operator licence, through the Civil Aviation Authority consent under the Spaceport regulations, and also a marine licence that needs to be applied for every launch as well. So we really are saying up to 10 launches in a year.
Okay, and again for Mark, the launch vehicle trajectory that was shown earlier seems to be exclusively to the west. Why then can't the launches be carried out from Kinetic at Heb Range?
Well, there are a number of reasons. One is because MOD utilise the range, and our commercial activity would not fit in well there. The other reason is that actually the trajectories that we want to use, and that the one you saw there was just one example. And there is another trajectory which goes out to the potentially, or an arc that goes out to the north of St Kilda that we may wish to use as well, and that is not accessible from the range. So we have had a discussion about this, but the range is not suitable for what we're trying to do.
Thank you. And going back to Laura and Sarah, was a bat survey undertaken? The quick answer to that was no. The scope of the EIA was defined really by the original scoping exercise undertaken, and we haven't identified any potentially significant impacts on bats which would justify a bat survey. Thanks. A very topical question. So considering COP26 and all that we know of how to preserve the planet, is this venture a decision on the right side of history? Is it genuinely ethical? Laura, Sarah, do you want to kick this response off?
It's perhaps worth thinking about what the suborbital launch vehicles are for, and they're for a range of purposes, including remote sensing and various research and things, but particularly about atmospheric science and climate science. So the purpose of these launch vehicles is to further that kind of research, and also just thinking about the scale of these proposals as well. There's a small proportion of rocket fuels that adopt hydrocarbon-based fuels as a propellant, such as kerosene. Due to the high levels of efficiency required for rocket fuels, non-fossil fuels are more frequently adopted as an alternative, such as hydrogen peroxide, liquid oxygen, and the sector is actively working to continually develop new alternative fuels to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
And I think, there's been one of the potential tenants of the spaceport includes a launch operator who's developed, instead of using kerosene, is now using what they've termed ecosene, which is a kerosene type substance made out of recycled plastic. Mark, you might be able to expand on this. And there is, through the various policy documents issued by the UK and Scotland, a very strong commitment by the space sector to bring in further reusability of components, focus on fuel efficiencies, using things like ecosene fuels to reduce their impact. So there is an aspiration by the sector itself to reduce their carbon footprint as well. But I suppose, Mark, you might be able to expand on that a little bit as well.
Am I on? Yes. Yeah. So, well, you really covered it, actually, Laura. The majority of operators that we are looking at are using very modern systems, and there is a relentless drive amongst the industry now to, because of the pressure of the CO2 and other environmental issues, is to make these vehicles as clean as they possibly can be. So, as Laura has mentioned, one of the operators is now making their own, effectively, kerosene, known as RP1, by recycling waste materials. Other operators are actively seeking much cleaner fuel mixes. So we're very confident that we will be adopting the best practice from the point of view of propellants. So I think that's as far as I can go, really.
Thanks. A question here, I think it relates to the EIA. So did you look at why the development should not be at Skolpig?
Who take that?
Sorry, yourself, Laura, or Sarah?
So yeah, so I guess this relates to some of the sort of earlier slides that we presented. So as consultants, we're often just given a site to look at and say, develop that or do an EIA for that. And we have to assess that site. And sometimes there are constraints which make that development unfeasible for whatever reason. And sometimes there aren't. And with Skolpig, there genuinely does seem to be relatively very few environmental constraints, particularly now the development has been reduced from the original scoped infrastructure. It's our job as consultants to advise clients in terms of probability and risk and the consentability of a project. And our view is that, this is a good site for this type of development and has relatively few constraints and is certainly consentable. Sarah, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, it just really relates back. You'll see in the EIA when you get a chance to have a look that the site selection alternatives considered has to be assessed, and that's been done very early in the process. And Laura alluded to that early on in the assessment, where different sites were compared, and the Skolpig site has been deemed as one of the most suitable sites for suborbital development, and particularly, as Laura says, the site's been scaled back somewhat.
Thank you. So just conscious that we're going to run over time, but if you're happy to stay on, and I think there's quite a few important questions being asked that we should cover. But just to reiterate, if we don't get to your question, we will respond to every question we've been presented, and that will be distributed to everybody that's attending, as well as being posted online. So, related to the development, what guarantees are given that this is not the first phase of a multi-stage development? Mark, do you want to take that?
Yeah, we've detuned our ambition, and so this is not the first stage of a multi-stage development.
Thank you. And again, Mark, how many of the jobs that you mentioned are likely to be above the minimum wage? And just a comment about, we have more than enough poorly paid jobs here.
Yeah, so we've provisioned in the financial plan for all of the jobs to be above minimum wage, and actually some way above minimum wage. Thanks.
Sorry, you're in the hot seat again. Who will be using the launch facility? Who are the target customers, and why will they use this facility over any other that are planned for the UK?
So two generic customer types. One is vehicle developers. So vehicle developers tend to, not all of them, but many of them tend to go through smaller, medium-sized, large vehicles. And we are targeting the smaller end of that bracket. So vehicle developers, that doesn't mean that they're going to turn up with a vehicle that has a high level of risk associated with it. And in fact, if they did, they wouldn't be allowed to launch either by the regulator or by ourselves. And the other bracket is the science community. So there are some real benefits to doing parabolic suborbital flights, particularly associated with measurement of the atmosphere. So we are putting a lot of effort into, and this is where we start to talk about the payloads on board the vehicles. So we're putting a lot of effort into trying to raise interest, and I have to say there is a lot of interest from the science community. So why would they use us instead of the other sites? Well, we've essentially differentiated ourselves from the other sites because we are focusing on suborbital launch. It's a smaller endeavour, and because it's suborbital launch, although there is one other site that I know is doing a suborbital launch as a trial run ahead of orbital activity, nobody else at the moment in the UK is focusing on suborbital launch. So we're going for that niche in the market, and what we've discovered is that the market it seems to be quite buoyant.
Okay, so a final one for you, Mark. The size of the rockets has varied a lot over time since this proposal began. What will the consortium commit to as being the maximum size of launch vehicle that will ever be launched from the Skolpic site?
Right, so I can't give you I'll respond in writing on that, because there isn't I can't give you a single metric. If I give you a size of vehicle, then that might not be representative of the amount of fuel on board. The amount of fuel on board drives quite a lot of the safety considerations. So what I'll do is I'll give you a fuller answer to that. What the answer is likely to be, it'll be a maximum of this size in terms of propellant mass. It's likely to be a maximum of this size in terms of actual size, but it's not something I can just give you a trite answer to.
If I might just add, in terms of the EIA, we've assessed the worst case parameters, and therefore the largest launch rocket that can be launched from the site, and we'll have those details within the EIA report in terms of the maximum size, just as Mark describes, the most fuel, the noisiest possible launch rocket, the rocket that will jettison the most stages into the sea area. So we've covered those maximum parameters under any planning consent that may be given for the spaceport, but mainly for the next stage for the licenses for operating at the site as well. So everything's within a sort of maximum project envelope, if you will, for what would be consented at the site and what could then be launched from the site. Okay, and a last question for Sarah and Laura, and it's quite long, so bear with me. So will details be given to residents within each of the zones of the absolute impact from sonic boom, etc., of each launch to each resident noted on the map?
it's surely only fair that each resident understands this in full, not just a map or diagram that is meaningless to the noise disturbance that will be created. And then a supplementary about information being provided to residents on the length of time noise will take to dissipate. So that's probably one you can respond to in writing in more detail, but I guess it relates to the modelling that's been done.
Yeah, well, quickly on the sonic boom relates to some launch vehicles that generate sonic boom on the descent. So we've modelled 3 trajectories of sonic boom, and there's a really quite limited impact on residential receptors, and the length of the duration of that sonic boom is less than 1 second. Just noted the second part of the question.
So it's providing information to each resident in areas noted on the map.
There will be notification about launches that are happening. Each launch in advance, there'll be community notifications about when they're happening. But as Laura says, there's very different types of launch vehicles that would be launched from the site, and not all will produce a sonic boom. And some that do may be nearer shore, but others may be further offshore and less audible to local residents.
Also, the noise profile as it dissipates away from the centre of the site starts to become comparable to standard noise generation of, say, a tractor or a car on the road. So if you're looking at some of the residential receptors over a kilometre away, it's the noise generation would be comparable, or would be in line with the baseline. So notifying residents, particularly of the noise elements, would probably not be particularly useful in that context. But if there are particular areas that the questioner feels they would like to know the particular noise impact, then we can definitely look at that.
And I'll squeeze one last one in for Mark. Sorry, Murdo. What are the level of jobs, Mark? And it's the person's asking, is it, for example, 20 guard jobs?
No, I saw that. There are 2 guards in the plan, and the level of job, the rest of the jobs are associated with supporting the operation, so that they are quite technical jobs. And just to embellish that a little bit more, one of the elements of the Spaceport license that we need to submit is how will we train the people on site, and I am seeking permission through that process from the CAA to effectively really train as many people as we possibly can from no knowledge of space to being able to deliver this in a safe way. And the reason we're doing that is because it is absolutely my ambition that these jobs are available to people on the islands. Frankly, if we end up with 20 people coming to the islands for 2 weeks every now and again, we've got this wrong. So that is not the ambition at all. So the majority of the jobs are technical, and some of them are very technical. For instance, there's quite a large cadre of the forecast team who will be working with the launch operators on their projects and being involved with the safety analysis and so on. And that is those are not trivial skills.
Thank you. So, as I said, apologies if we didn't get to your questions. We will get to them in the written. I'm forgetting my words now. Sorry. We will get to them in the document that's going to be sent out to you and published online. I'm apologising as well for kind of jumping about all over the place in terms of EIA questions or business plan type questions. So we will group them together before we publish them and send them out to you. So thank you for those.
Okay, I think it just leaves it for me to wrap it up. And thank you all very much for attending. Good attendance for an evening meeting. And as Alison has said, all the questions will be published online in due course. Thank you very much, and thanks to the panel as well for being available to answer the questions.
Thank you.